Okay, great. Hi, Riley. Thanks for agreeing to do this. Just for everyone's sort of background information, Riley installed a pretty amazing show in our space in Pioneer Square that is the Pilchuck exhibition space. And we were really lucky to have an opening, but then shortly after, of course, the space, as with many other exhibition spaces around the country, has been closed to the public since then. So with Gas's virtual conference, we thought it was a really great opportunity to get that show out to an even wider audience. And Riley has agreed to give us a little insight, has created a really cool 3D model for touring the show in a virtual space, which, as you'll see as our conversation goes along, is quite appropriate for a lot of the work and a lot of the concepts that Riley addresses in his work. So Riley, you were an artist in residence, if I remember correctly, in 2018. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was invited to be an artist in residence by Tina Fierro. She actually used to be my boss at 911 Media Arts Center a number of years ago.
Awesome. You know, I know from our conversations that a lot of the work sort of grew out of that residency experience. So I was wondering if you just maybe you could describe what that experience was like and what it sort of stimulated in your art practice.
Yeah, so I was there for 3 weeks, and my background is in new media, so I'm not a glassblower. So it was a really great opportunity to apply some of my art practice to the glassblowing medium and to work with glassblowers at Pilchuck. Something I was experimenting with while I was there was producing a application for a mixed reality headset for glassblowers to view holographic simulated content while simultaneously blowing glass. So mixed reality is this kind of emerging medium where you can wear a head-mounted display that you can see through, but simultaneously have digital content coexist with you within your environment. And so I thought it would be really interesting to apply that to the glassblowing process and to have a simulated iteration of a sculpture that a glassblower could see while simultaneously blowing glass, and use that as a reference for glassblowing production.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll get into mixed reality a bit later, because I think it really plays in, well, certainly to the show, but also how it's being experienced in this sort of odd reality that we're in. Let's start with the title of the show. The show is titled The Duality Paradox, and to quote your artist statement, the duality paradox is a theory in physics that every quantum object exhibits both particle and wave characteristics. The theory suggests that the properties of a particle cannot be fully described without considering the wave attributes and vice versa. How did the different work in the show relate to this theory, and how do you visualize something simultaneously in our reality as both a particle and a wave?
Right. So the works explore the duality paradox in different ways. So for example, the main piece entitled The Duality Paradox combines glassblowing with a traditional theater technique called Pepper's Ghost. And basically what this involves is having a 45-degree mirror that is simultaneously reflective and transparent. So you can see through it, but also see content reflected off of it. And in the exhibit, I have a physical sculpture behind the mirror of a Mobius strip. And then composited over that on the mirror is a digital iteration of a Mobius strip. And the idea here is to juxtapose the simulated version of a Mobius strip with the physical version of it, and have the two start to bridge together into one cohesive paradigm. So what happens in that environment too is the digital iteration of the Mobius strip is interactive, using a sensor for hand tracking. And so viewers can reach into the simulated content and stimulate the Mobius strip and have it change its form. And so it defaults back to its archetypal form. So that was actually one of the themes for my residency at Pilchuck, was archetype. And so there's the archetypal form of the Mobius strip at its default state, and as users interact with it, they add entropy to the form and displace all the different native parameters that make up that geometry. And so the form displaces and becomes more dynamic. And then when a user stops interacting with it, it slowly retreats back to its original archetypal state of being. That composites over the physical sculpture, which is really a kind of encapsulated iteration of a certain state of being of the Mobius strip.
Interesting. So you have both static and things that are perpetually changed, and you have, it's interesting that you're also both using sort of old virtual techniques mixed in with, you know, new media as you described. It seems that in looking at the work, like some of your interest is in modeling, right? As in creating these other realities, but also where those break down and where, you know, they are still essentially human created. So where the sort of hand, if you will, is revealed in that technology. Does technology in some ways become less interesting or less useful to you as it becomes more refined, as it becomes sort of more quote unquote perfect?
For me, I actually really appreciate the spectrum of output that technology has to offer. So really, for me, technology is it's its own electronic ecosystem, similar to something like Tron, where there are things that exist only within that paradigm. But trying to find ways to merge that ecosystem with our own physical reality, I find very interesting. And for me, it's about thinking holistically with technology, because, for example, I work with virtual reality, I work with mixed reality. I also dabble with machine learning and the Internet of Things. And each one of these components is a part of a larger kind of holistic ecosystem of technology, where they can contribute to each other in various ways to make a larger kind of experience. So, for example, with machine learning, machine learning is really changing the way that our society is evolving, and it has a huge influence on the trajectory of humanity in terms of the application of predictive analytics to make determinations about what the future might hold. And then that creates a branch in the trajectory of our path in terms of what we choose to pursue or not to pursue. So for me, technology just becomes, it becomes more and more interesting the deeper you get into it. It's kind of this infinite feedback loop. It's recursive. The more you play with technology, the more it starts to feed back on itself. I mean, in tech, you get what's called a feedback loop. And it's very similar to what the mind does in terms of thought. you know, if you start thinking about thinking, then you're creating a feedback loop of thought. And the same thing applies to technology, where it will start to feed back on itself and just become more and more dynamic and interesting the deeper you get into it. And it will start to reveal deep questions that we currently have about, you know, what is consciousness? Like, what happens when a machine becomes self-aware? How can you prove that it's self-aware? You know, because it says that it feels pain, is that because it was instructed to say that, or is it because it actually is feeling pain? And then do we need to develop a whole new framework for what we consider to be conscious, and what sort of laws you know, might we have, like, surrounding like a sentient machine?
What is the ethical treatment of these, these new quote unquote life forms, or not life forms? Yeah, I mean, I think there's some pretty deep questions embedded in all of that. Maybe just to sort of back up a little bit for much of the audience, you've alluded to it a couple of times, but you know, many of us at least think that we have an understanding of this physical reality that we're inhabiting, and then we're beginning to wrap our brains around the fact that there are constructed digital. Can you talk a little bit more about mixed reality environments and why you find them particularly fertile ground for art making or for art practices?
Sure. So just to start with your question, I mean, you know, like you said, many of us think we understand our reality, but really that is something that we have
suspect, yes.
that is highly suspect. I mean, because it's actually virtualized as well. I mean, everyone is actually very experienced in virtual reality because we manufacture our own argument for what reality is and then have faith in that simulation. So, you know, there is the reality of the virtual, and that is that we have these constructs for belief, and we end up having faith in those constructs. And so everyone has been really well rehearsed throughout their lives in terms of virtual reality without even having put on a physical headset. Your self-identity is your own simulated version of yourself, your own virtual identity. With virtual reality as a medium, it's completely immersive and separate from the physical world, which has its limitations in terms of basically not being able to physically engage with the world. With mixed reality, you have your content coexist, digital content coexist with the physical world. And so this becomes an opportunity for more unique engagements with physical objects that are commonplace, and potentially highlighting something that was unique about those objects that you might not have noticed before. And methods for doing this that can be really interesting too are the combination, like I mentioned before, of mixed reality with things like IoT gateway, smart objects, embedded sensors, and cloud computing and machine learning. By combining all of these different components into one holistic system framework, you get a kind of seamless conversation going between not only the systems, but the objects that they are referencing within the world. So if you had like an object with an embedded smart sensor and you turn a sculpture into a smart sculpture, then you can make all these different callbacks between the user, the user's location in space, the object itself, and create unique events that are completely new in terms of how an object is experienced.
Or what an object even starts to starts to be, I think, in a certain way. I mean, you know, there's so many different starting points for creating objects at that point. They are generated in the virtual, they're generated in the reality and brought. It's very interesting how things move through these dimensions, I find, in your work. And now that, you know, this interview will be accompanied by a 3D model that you created, maybe you can talk a little bit more about that process and how, you know, the documentation of this show has maybe added another layer onto the sort of.
The tour that I've made is actually a 360 camera still tour. So in this case, I went back down to the exhibit and with a 360 camera and took 360 photos at different key locations at every work within the exhibit. And then through a browser or through an Oculus headset, a user can look around at each 360 image and then teleport to each hotspot and view the work from there. So yeah, it's definitely gone full circle. It went from digital to physical, back to digital.
And who knows, it might make another leap in the future. I did want to ask you, since I had a really interesting conversation with your very precocious daughter at a different art opening, how, you know, I mean, there's some pretty deep thought or, you know, concept embedded in a lot of this work, but it's also, you know, I'm always struck by the sort of digital struggles that are instant fluency for sort of a younger generation as well. And I'm just curious how you talk about your work with your daughter, if you have any suggestions for parents about how they should be, not necessarily just artwork, but technology in general, if there's ways that are helpful to talk or understand sort of the future of technology with their kids.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's very interesting for her. For example, she has been working in virtual reality since she was like 3 years old. I actually have volumetric video captures of her when she was like 2.5, and that's really bizarre to have a memory of a person represented as a volume. So I can play her back and she'll like be running around me chasing a ball from when she was like two years old.
Whoa.
It's really weird. And she loves playing in virtual reality. She comes into my office frequently and we'll do painting in software called Tilt Brush. There's also a virtual reality coloring book that she uses. And she also does use mixed reality. And so something she's also done there is she's been able to shake her own hand as a digital double. And
that's particularly appropriate in these days. You know, you can't shake anyone's hands. She can shake her own hand.
Yeah, as a
no germ transfer there.
Yeah, no, it's bizarre. Yeah, because you can simulate the sense of contact, even though you aren't really making contact.
Right.
But for her, I think it's, you know, it's really about, if she's interested, I'll show her things and let her experiment. And you know, I try not to be too restrictive with some of the tech. I mean, some of these headsets are pretty expensive, and she's just, you know, I just try to show her how to use it, and she's actually better and more respectful of the tech than most adults, from my experience. And I think it's just because, you know, her generation has been brought up with these devices, and their fluency in technology is much more developed at an early age than ours. In terms of talking about the work, I just try to expose her to it and see what she thinks. you know, some of my stuff is abstract and a little bizarre, and you know, most of the time she's really receptive of it. She thinks it's just weird and cool.
Yeah. No, I'm always blown away by the lateral thinking too, that sometimes, you know, they're just connections that are integral to the work and that we're aware of possibly on a subconscious level, but a lot of our rational thought overlays sort of edit out some of the most obvious and amazing things about work. That's one of the reasons I enjoy talking to children about what they get out of work, because sometimes they're more on it than the rest of us, you know.
And it was something, you know, when I've done these exhibits, like at galleries and museums where I do have headsets available, children are usually the first in line. They're kind of like my main audience.
Yeah.
And the first thing they try to do is figure out what's going on and see if they can break it. And they are the best stress testers for any digital installation, because if your work is able to endure the pressures that they put on it, and you don't have to reboot it and the system doesn't crash, then that means that it's definitely a stable piece for
for general audience. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to sort of walk through the different pieces in the show, or
yeah, I could actually jump into this 360 tour here and share my screen and just talk about.
Yeah.
Okay, so currently this is the 360 tour of the exhibit.
Cool.
And if you click and drag with your main mouse button, you can look around the space. And then this center cursor, if you align this with different icons, some supporting, depending on what the icon is, some supporting information about the work will appear, such as the title and the year and the materials. And then these other icons are hotspots for teleporting around the space. So if you hover over them for a brief amount of time, it will teleport you to that work. I'm just going to return to this first one here.
So Reilly, who were the glassblowers that you worked with when you were at Pilchuck?
So yeah, my gaffers were Joe Grant and Kazuki Takazawa. And then my artist assistant was Hugh Willa. And the three of them were just, they were a lot of fun to work with. I also had a residency at the Museum of Glass in Tacoma. So this piece right here, this is called Eon Cycles. And this is kind of based off of Roger Penrose's theory of cyclical universes. Basically like the concept that there is no beginning and no end. Basically at the end of a cosmic cycle, a new one spawns. And I was just trying to encapsulate that concept into a piece of glass. And so here you can see there's a torus within a torus within a torus. So this is that kind of recursive feedback behavior that I was talking about before. And the torus, like, this comes back to how we simulate our reality. And the torus is based off of the models that we have for the geometry of a black hole. And the idea here is that this is really a black hole within a black hole within a black hole. And the reticello kind of phyllotaxis pattern that you're seeing here is supposed to represent the distortion of the fabric of space-time that occurs as a byproduct of the geometry of a black hole. And so the white lines are actually supposed to represent a particle and a wave of light, as if this is light that is falling into the gravity well of a black hole. And so it's using, so I like the idea of using white to define a black hole, and and also clear, because a black hole you can't see, but you can see light being consumed by a black hole.
Mm-hmm.
You can't see what happens when the light goes into the black hole, but
Right.
you can see it affected. It's the trajectory of light being affected by the distortion in the fabric of space-time. So there are a number of different kind of layers of play here in terms of how to represent that concept. If we go over here, this right here is, I call this closed string. And so this is based off of the theory in physics called string theory, which is basically that everything that exists is made out of tiny vibrating strands of energy. And the dynamic properties of those strands of energy are so diverse that they are responsible for everything that you see in the universe. The diversity of these strings is and the properties of these strings is what makes nature so diverse and dynamic. Mm-hmm. And so this is supposed to be a kind of encapsulated iteration of one of those strings, and it's supposed to be both a wave and a particle. If you imagine a particle traversing in this path, it would create the waveform that you're seeing here. Over here, here's an archetypal form of a Mobius strip. And for me, this also falls into the category of string theory, where you have a closed string, something that is finite, but also infinite in terms of the surface of this object. Mm-hmm. This comes up in string theory a lot when you talk about higher dimensions. So something that occurs as a byproduct of string theory is that there are additional dimensions beyond the fourth dimension. There's potentially 10 dimensions. And a dimension is really just a degree of freedom. And when you talk about finite, infinite finiteness, you're really talking about the potential for what is known as a multiverse, where there are infinite iterations of finite finite cosmic events. So some geometries that appear within the framework of string theory are these forms called Calabi-Yau manifolds. And so that's what this is an attempt at representing. This is supposed to be a 6-dimensional form. And so when we're talking about the 6th dimension, it has to do with what things, the behavior of geometry and dimension at the quantum level. So if you imagine looking out at this is a common metaphor that's given, is if you look at a power line from a distance, it looks flat. But if you zoom in on it and get closer and closer to it, you realize it has more dimensions than just one. And the same applies to the quantum scale. If you get down to the Planck scale, it's the smallest known scale, the closer you get to it, the more we start to realize that it's not just a flat thing that we're looking at from a distance. It has dynamic properties that we can't really observe because we don't have tools that are powerful enough to actually look at that scale or that dimension. And by trying to observe it, we add energy to the tools, and that energy that we add to the tools basically disrupts the observation itself. Mm-hmm. So that's what's known as the observer effect. Mm-hmm. So a lot of these forms are efforts to visualize things that are really at the boundary of our perception.
And then what is this specific form? How does it what characterizes it as a sixth dimensional form? I
Oh,
understand you're.
yeah. Okay. So something that happens with these geometries, there's actually two. So this is a duality. The second form, I I couldn't make. It was quite difficult to fabricate. But basically, these forms, uh, uh, they come in pairs, and uh, when you apply the higher dimensional uh, math to the geometry of these forms, they are actually the same form, but they look completely different from each other.
Okay.
But on our lower dimensional scale, they look like two separate forms, but they are actually equivalent within the higher dimensional geometry. And this form, it's kind of hard to tell, but it has a lot of weird stuff going on in it, where the form is kind of like folding in on itself and intersecting in really kind of abstract ways that are uncommon to our kind of terrestrial territory.
So if I follow you correctly, there's two forms. They look entirely different in our dimension, but if we were somehow able to visualize six dimensions, we realize that we're just looking that our angle is just off in a sense that they're actually identical forms.
Exactly.
Huh. Interesting. Cool.
And let's just teleport around here. So this piece over here, this is supposed to represent a sound wave, as if the audio wave were volumized. So if you imagine me speaking and you could see like the sound coming out of my mouth, it would be creating these kind of volumetric ripples in the air. And this is known as a sphere harmonic mathematically. And so on the right-hand side here, this is another interactive hand tracking experience. And this display is actually a glasses-free holographic display called the looking glass display. So in the exhibit, when you look at this, you actually see a volumetric render of a sphere harmonic. And these, you were asking me about modeling before. A lot of these forms aren't modeled in a 3D program. They're actually they're generated procedurally. It's called procedural content generation, where an algorithm is actually responsible for making the geometry appear in a computer simulated environment in real time. And then the parameters that drive that form dynamically change over time and are affected by users' interaction with them. So when someone puts their hand over this hand tractor, their hand appears as a mirrored iteration of itself in the holographic viewer, and then they can make contact with that procedurally generated form and interact with it. And again, this is back to duality, where you have your physical hand and your simulated hand, a physical form, a simulated iteration of the form, and those two paradigms kind of colliding.
So if that form is generated from sound, then potentially you could generate sound out of these manipulations as well, right?
Oh,
like if there's a relationship sound to form.
yeah. So the sounds, the forms make sounds, and those sounds are also procedurally generated and based off of the algorithm that drives the form. So the sounds, there's not only the visual component that is procedurally generated, but the sounds are also reflected by the procedural generation of the form.
Cool. And the manipulation, the viewer manipulation affects the sound, or?
Yes, yeah. So when you interact with the object, it affects the sound as well.
Cool.
Over here, these forms I'm calling cosmic inflation. And so that has to do with the origins of a universe and its expansion. And so currently, our model for our cosmos is not this kind of abstract, like triple bubble behavior, but another cosmos within the framework of string theory could easily have this sort of boundary to it. And I like the idea of breaking beyond the boundary of our cosmos and experimenting with other cosmic potentialities, even if they are not true. It's still a testament of human creativity and ingenuity and the desire to know not only what our cosmos is about, but what is beyond and implied about what is outside of our cosmos. Here we have another Mobius strip. So this isn't a traditional iteration. This isn't like the archetypal Mobius strip that you saw back here. This is an iteration of a Mobius strip that has kind of evolved and changed over time. And so my background is in photography, video, and sculpture. And so I like to think of these sculptures as almost as if they were a photograph or a snapshot of an object that is actually in a state of animation. And you're just encapsulating a moment in time of the evolution of this form. And so this was one of the, using the same, so the Mobius strip is made using an algorithm as well. And so by tweaking the parameters that make that Mobius strip, I was able to stumble upon this kind of unique iteration of how Mobius strip could look. So it's following the same rule set. It's just not falling within the archetype of the form. It's bending the parameters to create a new representation of that form.
So interesting. Yeah, I think there's all kinds of implied, just in the forms themselves. There's so much implied movement or reference to time, it seems like.
Definitely, yeah. This is another example that I think fits right in with that argument. This is called subatomic symbiosis. And so the idea here is that this is representing two particles that have collided and now are creating that kind of Fibonacci spiral that you see in like the Large Hadron Collider when you're simulating particle collisions. And so it's as if the particle is at each one of these points, but then this is the wave that is made by that collision. And so we see a lot of behavior like this in not only on the quantum level but also on the cosmic level. Like we just recently discovered gravitational waves, which occurs when two black holes collide, and that creates a massive ripple in throughout the cosmos that we can calculate using very precise lasers that are embedded under the earth, and we can see distortions in the length of those lasers showing that the earth is actually expanding and contracting underneath the tension of the ripples of gravity waves.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me that, here we are looking at a model of whatever, aside from all those interesting questions of how we're actually experiencing this. These are objects that are describing in a visual way things that we are not, as humans, are not really, we can't perceive anything below the microscopic or even the visual level, or perceive these universal effects that you're talking about, or at least we're not conscious of that perception if we do actually have that hardware. So it's intriguing to me that it seems like those are the scales where things important stuff actually happens, and that humans are uniquely, or not uniquely, but are unable to really sense these things. So we've invented these, you know, in the way that you're talking about, we can measure these things with lasers and stuff, but they're all implicit. It's all created by humans and has all kinds of bias built into our understanding of the results and stuff. It's just interesting to look at these physical manifestations of things that are so far removed from something that we can experience, you know.
Right. Yeah. They're a part of the terrestrial domain, but they're extraterrestrial in terms of our
Yeah.
ability to actually perceive them.
Yeah.
You know, just to kind of undermine what we think we understand about reality.
It's always healthy, I think. It's always healthy.
Yeah.
Question.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh,
I
sorry.
thought I thought that what, you know, what you started the interview with, I'm still thinking, yeah, I mean, how indebted we are to our own sort of understanding of, quote unquote, the reality that we're moving through. But then how that's a whole ecosystem of everybody inventing that for themselves, and then the overlaps of all of those realities is where things get messy and misunderstood.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, uh, you know, people come to an agreement on certain concepts that they want to have faith in, and that can be religion, that can be philosophy, that can be science, and then science, it reaches a point too where, you know, as I was talking about with the Calabi-Yau manifolds back there, those objects we cannot detect, but they are implied through mathematics. We don't have the
Right.
tools to perceive them, and at that point, is that science? I mean, there's, you know, we don't have evidence of these, and science is about, you know, observation and experimentation. And so at a certain point, it does become a belief architecture, a framework that you end up embracing because so many other things surrounding that pursuit, you know, seem concrete.
But you don't have to go to the quantum level to have that, you know, uncertainty or bias. I mean, if you're looking through a man-made optical instrument that we know distorts reality so that you can have observational evidence of something, then you've just created your own image that, you know, more times than not supports whatever it is that you're looking for evidence of, you know. I don't know. I mean, I love science. I don't question the basic premise of science, but there's all kinds of belief built into that
No, exactly.
pursuit as
No,
well.
exactly. And it's like the closer you get to what you would consider a truth, the further you are from it, because you are actually
Yeah.
uh, you are embracing a model that you've constructed for the truth rather than the truth itself. Uh, you know, there are those strange things that basically cancel each other out within semiotics and within science. Um, you know, for example, when in photography, if you know, photograph an object that's passing you at a high frame rate, at a high shutter speed, then you are able to get a much more accurate representation of its position in space, but you are canceling out the ability to represent its momentum, and vice versa. If you have a low shutter speed, then you are representing it more as a wave, and you get a better sense of the object's momentum, but you are canceling out the ability to perceive its position. This other form, this I don't have a hotspot for this currently, but I'm going to introduce one. So this is a interactive display that uses a depth camera to skeletal track people. So when you walk up to this monitor, you end up being mirrored as a digital double within the environment as a skeleton. And and there's an object in there that you can interact with. And the object is, it's actually a sphere that has a algorithm applied to it called the super formula. And what the super formula is an algorithm that allows you to procedurally generate most forms that you see in nature. And so the title of this piece is called Morphogenesis. And morphogenesis is a biological process in which organisms take on different forms and evolve into different forms. And so the idea here is that you're starting with a base form, you know, like a stem cell, just a sphere, and then dynamically evolving into a spectrum of diverse geometries from that point. And again, here, when the user interacts with it, they affect the geometry of the form. They also affect the sound that the form is generating. So there's, in the exhibit, there's not only kind of the origins of physical phenomena, but also the origins of biological systems. And then over here is
the interplay between the two, yeah.
And then here again, this is the Duality Paradox, just to give you an idea of the Pepper's ghost effect. So you can see, here's the mirror. It's actually reflecting a monitor up here that is the Mobius strip that you can interact with. And then that is overlapping and intersecting with a physical iteration of the Mobius strip. And then down here, there's the hand tracker. So users can reach in to the simulated environment and stimulate it and engage with the digital form. And their hands are represented within that rendering as well. So again, it's this effort to bridge physical and digital paradigms and to kind of blur the granular boundary that we construct for these things and make it more of a fluid analog wave.
Cool. Huh. Yeah, I like the, you know, it's interesting, you know, the pieces in and of themselves, having gotten a walkthrough, are each sort of contain their a whole set of sort of conceptual dilemmas, right? But I love the sort of, as I'm seeing these overviews, the sort of overlapping visuals and optics, the way that glass works to sort of portray the fact that all of these sort of theories are coexisting in a messy space that we're trying to describe and don't quite understand. You know, it seems like there's just levels of a onion with this show, you know, and then the ways that we're actually experiencing it are a whole another layer on that onion. But I really appreciate you taking the time to give us some insight into the show, and hopefully a lot of people enjoy this virtual experience.
Yeah, so this virtual experience is on my website, and you can access it through a desktop browser and also through a Oculus virtual reality headset. I'm currently working on publishing it to support mobile devices as well, and I'll be introducing a few more little hotspots here for for morphogenesis, for example, and some like kind of video components to some of the interactive parts of the exhibit. But for the most part, like I like where this is currently. It's kind of a minimum viable product, but it loads well. It doesn't consume a lot of memory, which is important in terms of streamlining something like this. But you don't want someone staring at a load bar for 30 minutes.
Right.
But something else too, like for me, just working with glass, that I found really engaging is how it can encapsulate the entropy of forms. Like you take something that I wanted for this exhibit, but they got destroyed, were I had these really long waveforms made
Yeah.
out of
Yeah.
glass. I had one that was like 25 feet long, but it was basically taking, you know, when the glass was hot, it was at a state of high entropy, and we were stimulating it and sending waveforms down it, and then it rapidly cooled
Yeah.
to a point of zero entropy, and it was able to encapsulate uh, uh, that state of being when it was at high entropy. And there aren't really a lot of materials that can do that.
Yeah.
I also really liked, just with glass in general, as a metaphor for the fragility of the models that we manufacture.
Mm.
You know, like glass is a durable material, but it can break.
As you discovered, it sounds like.
Yeah, yeah, and so can our frameworks for reality. You
Yeah.
know, like they're just as delicate. You know, look at what we're going through right now. Like humanity is experiencing massive ego loss.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, and then we make arguments for like getting back to normal. Well, what it was that in the first place? I mean,
Yeah.
you know, what a framework for indentured servitude and exploitation of each other.
And rapid demise into an uninhabitable planet. Yeah.
Right. You know, so I mean, there are a lot of questions that we need to be asking ourselves right now rather than trying to go into the past. We can't go into the past. We need to look to the future. You know,
Yeah.
we need to think about how we're going to treat the planet and how we're going to treat each other.
Yeah. I think as artists, one of our role is to be probing ahead of where the public is willing to go in certain, or at least asking the questions. And you know, I think it's of an essence. I think this virus has revealed more than it has destroyed, maybe, in a way. And it's been a very tough lesson about humanity and our ability to do what we will. So perhaps we'll leave it on that somewhat somber note, but I thank you all for checking this out, and we look forward to welcoming you to see Reilly's show in hopefully in the near future when we can open the doors of the Pilchuck exhibition space.
Yeah, and thanks for having me and giving me the opportunity to show at Pilchuck. And I look forward to developing more glass art in the future.
Right.